Ilara stood at the front of the small church in Copper Springs, her hands trembling as she clutched a wilted bouquet of wildflowers. The entire town had crowded into the wooden building to witness what they were calling the wedding of the century, though not for romantic reasons. They had come to see the fat merchant's daughter marry Barnaby Hutchins, the handsome but perpetually broke gambler who everyone knew was only marrying her for her father's money. At 23 years old and nearly 300 pounds, Ilara had resigned herself to this fate. Her father, Edmund Thatcher, owned the largest general store in 3 territories, and he had made it clear that Ilara's marriage to Barnaby was a business transaction. Barnaby would get access to the Thatcher fortune. Edmund would get a son-in-law who could charm customers and expand the business, and Ilara would get a husband. Any husband, because according to her father, beggars couldn't be choosers, and a woman of Ilara's size should be grateful anyone would have her at all. The church was stifling, packed with spectators whispering behind gloved hands and fans. Ilara could hear their commentary, sharp and cruel despite the supposedly sacred setting. Poor thing, squeezed into that dress like sausage and casing. Barnaby must really be desperate for money. I give it 6 months before he takes a mistress. What man could actually bed that? Each whisper was a knife, but Ilara kept her chin up and her eyes fixed on the altar, where Reverend Morrison waited with his Bible. She had survived 23 years of mockery and contempt. She could survive this too. At least as a married woman, she would have some measure of independence from her father's house. Perhaps Barnaby would be kind, or at least indifferent. It was the best she could hope for. The church doors opened, and Barnaby was supposed to enter and take his place beside her. Instead, his best man, a weaselly character named Silas, hurried down the aisle alone, his face pale and sweating. He whispered urgently to Reverend Morrison, who blanched and looked at Ilara with something like pity. "Miss Thatcher," the Reverend said quietly, though in the silent church everyone could hear, "I'm afraid there's been a situation. Mr. Hutchins he's not coming." The church erupted in gasps and excited whispers. Ilara stood frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. "What do you mean he's not coming?" Silas cleared his throat nervously. "He left town this morning on the early stage. Took the money your father advanced him for wedding expenses and, well, he's gone. He said to tell you that he just couldn't go through with it," he said. Silas hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "What did he say?" Ilara demanded, though she already knew it would be terrible. "He said he had his limits, and marrying someone like you exceeded them. Said no amount of money was worth—" Silas broke off, looking genuinely sorry. "I'm sorry, Miss Thatcher. He's a coward and a fool." The church exploded with noise, shocked exclamations, delighted laughter, pitying murmurs. Ilara stood paralyzed at the altar, the full horror of her situation crashing down on her. She had been jilted. Left at the altar. Abandoned in front of the entire town by a man who had decided she was too repulsive to marry even for money. The humiliation was so complete, so devastating, that she couldn't even cry. She simply stood there, clutching her wilted flowers, while the town laughed at the pathetic fat girl who couldn't even keep a mercenary groom. "Well, this has been entertaining," someone called out from the back, sparking fresh laughter. "Anyone want to place bets on how long before she finds another fool willing to take Thatcher's money?" "Nobody's that desperate," another voice replied. "Poor girl's going to die a spinster for sure." Ilara's father pushed his way to the front, his face purple with rage, not at Barnaby's betrayal but at the public embarrassment. "Get out of here," he hissed at Ilara. "You've made me a laughingstock. Get out of my sight." Before Ilara could move, before she could process the command, or the continued laughter, or the complete destruction of whatever shreds of dignity she had left, a voice rang out from the back of the church, deep, commanding, and carrying absolute authority. "Silence!" The church fell instantly quiet. Every head turned to see who had spoken with such force. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. As he strode down the aisle, details became clear. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders so broad he barely fit through the church door. His muscular frame was evident even through his simple clothes, his arms and chest showing the kind of definition that came from years of hard physical labor. Dark hair touched his collar, and a several days iron shadowed a strong jaw. But it was his eyes that caught and held attention, bright blue, fierce, and currently blazing with anger. Caleb Stone was a legend in Copper Springs, though he rarely came to town. He owned a sprawling ranch in the high country, ran cattle and horses, and was known as someone you didn't cross. There were stories about his past that he'd been a lawman who cleaned up 3 violent towns before retiring to ranch, that he'd killed a dozen men in self-defense, that he could break a horse or a man with equal ease. What everyone knew for certain was that Caleb Stone was dangerous, powerful, and not someone who tolerated fools or bullies. He walked straight to the altar, his boots echoing in the silent church, and stood before Ilara. Up close, she could see that his eyes, though fierce, held no mockery, only a burning anger directed at everyone but her. "Miss Thatcher," he said, his voice gentling though still carrying to every corner of the church. "I apologize for the interruption, but I couldn't stand by and watch this travesty continue." Ilara stared at him, unable to form words. Caleb Stone knew who she was speaking to her? In her shock, she simply nodded. Caleb turned to face the assembled crowd, his expression hardening into something that made several people shift nervously in their seats. "I came to town today to pick up supplies. I had no intention of attending this wedding, but when I heard what Barnaby Hutchins did running off with advance money, abandoning his bride at the altar, I decided I needed to be here. Not to gawk, not to laugh, but to offer an alternative." He turned back to Ilara, and his expression softened again. "Miss Thatcher, you and I have never formally met, though I've seen you in your father's store, where you've always been polite, efficient, and kind to customers, even when they didn't deserve it. You strike me as a woman of character and capability qualities I value far more than superficial appearance. So I'm going to make you an offer, right here, right now, in front of all these people." Caleb raised his voice so everyone could hear clearly. "Ilara Thatcher, will you marry me instead?" The church erupted in shocked gasps and excited whispers. Ilara felt the room spinning. This couldn't be real. This had to be some cruel joke, some final humiliation. I don't understand," she whispered. "It's simple," Caleb said. "I need a wife. I've been putting off marriage for years because I had no interest in the simpering society girls who can't tell a cow from a horse. But I've built a successful ranch, and I need a partner who can help run it. Someone practical, hardworking, and capable. That's you, Miss Thatcher. So I'm offering you a choice. You can stay here and face this ridicule, or you can marry me and come to my ranch. It won't be an easy life, but it will be an honest one, and I promise you'll be treated with respect." Before Ilara could respond, her father pushed forward. "Now see here, Stone. My daughter's not some charity case for you to take pity on." "This has nothing to do with pity," Caleb interrupted, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "This has to do with recognizing value when I see it. Your daughter has been running your store's books for years, hasn't she? Keeping inventory, managing orders, dealing with difficult customers. I've heard from suppliers that she's the real brains behind Thatcher's success. That's exactly the kind of partner I need." He looked at Ilara again. "But the choice is yours. I won't force this. If you say no, I'll leave, and you'll never hear from me again. But if you say yes, we can have Reverend Morrison perform the ceremony right now, and you can leave this place as my wife. So what do you say, Miss Thatcher? Will you marry me?" Ilara's mind raced. This was insane. Caleb Stone was offering to marry her not for her father's money, but because he thought she was capable? It had to be a trick, a joke, something. Men didn't marry women like her by choice, especially not men who looked like Caleb Stone, who could clearly have their pick of beautiful women. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw only sincerity and patience. He was genuinely waiting for her answer, giving her the choice Barnaby had never offered. And suddenly, Ilara realized she had nothing to lose. She was already publicly humiliated, already jilted, already the subject of town gossip. What was the worst that could happen? "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. Then, stronger. "Yes, Mr. Stone. I'll marry you." A smile crossed Caleb's face, transforming his harsh features into something almost gentle. He turned to Reverend Morrison. "You heard the lady, Reverend. Let's proceed with the ceremony." "But the bans," the Reverend began. "Can be waived in cases of necessity," Caleb said firmly. "And I'd say saving Miss Thatcher from further humiliation qualifies as necessity. Perform the ceremony, Reverend. Now." The Reverend, faced with Caleb's implacable determination, nodded and opened his Bible. The ceremony was brief, stripped of all the romantic flourishes that had been planned for Ilara's wedding to Barnaby. But when Caleb slipped a simple gold band onto Ilara's finger, a ring he produced from his pocket, as if he'd been prepared for this, and spoke his vows with quiet conviction, it felt more real than anything Ilara had experienced in her entire life. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Morrison said, somewhat uncertainly. Caleb looked at Ilara, clearly seeking permission. She nodded, still too shocked to fully process what was happening. He leaned down. He was so much taller that he had to bend considerably and pressed a gentle, respectful kiss to her lips. It was Ilara's first kiss, and it was nothing like she had imagined. It was brief and chaste, but it was also kind, and Caleb's hand on her arm was steady and warm. When he pulled back, he turned to face the assembled crowd, his arm moving protectively around Ilara's shoulders. "Let me make something very clear to all of you," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Ilara is my wife now. She's under my protection. If I hear of anyone mocking her, gossiping about her, or treating her with anything less than respect, they'll answer to me personally. She's mine now, so back off." The last two words were delivered with such force that several people actually flinched. The church fell silent again, and this time the silence held real fear. No one wanted to cross Caleb Stone, especially not when he was clearly prepared to defend his new wife against any and all comers. Edmund Thatcher pushed forward one last time. "Now see here, Stone. Ilara's my daughter, and I have rights." "You have no rights," Caleb interrupted coldly. "You were prepared to sell your daughter to a gambler for business purposes. You just told her to get out of your sight because she was humiliated through no fault of her own. You've forfeited any paternal rights you might have claimed. Ilara is my wife now, and she's coming with me. If you have any of her personal belongings at your house, you can send them to my ranch. Otherwise, stay away from her." He looked down at Ilara. "Do you have anything you need to collect before we leave?" Ilara thought of her small room in her father's house, the few possessions she truly cared about. "My mother's jewelry box," she said quietly. "And my books. They're all I really want." "Then let's get them," Caleb said. "We'll stop by your father's house on the way out of town." He guided Ilara down the aisle, his arm still protectively around her shoulders, while the assembled crowd parted before them like the Red Sea. As they reached the church door, Ilara heard whispers starting up again behind them, but they were different now, awed rather than mocking, speculative rather than cruel. Did that really just happen? Caleb Stone married her? Just like that? He looked ready to shoot anyone who said a word against her. Maybe there's more to her than we thought. At her father's house, Ilara quickly gathered her few precious belongings while Caleb waited, his presence ensuring that Edmund didn't try to interfere or make a scene. Within 20 minutes, they were in Caleb's wagon, heading out of Copper Springs toward the high country and his ranch. They rode in silence for a while, Ilara still trying to process the whirlwind of the past hour. Finally, she found her voice. "Why did you really do that? And please don't tell me it's because you need a bookkeeper. You could hire one for far less trouble than marrying someone." Caleb was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "You want the complete truth? Fine. I've been watching you for about a year now. Whenever I came to town for supplies, I'd see you in the store, dealing patiently with difficult customers, keeping perfect records, solving problems. I watched you handle a drunk cowboy who was harassing a young woman customer. You were firm but not cruel, protective but not hysterical. I saw you give credit to a family whose kids were hungry, even though your father would have refused if he'd known." He glanced at her. "I saw kindness, intelligence, capability, and quiet strength. Those are the qualities I value in a partner. When I heard you were marrying Barnaby Hutchins, I thought it was a waste a good woman tied to a worthless man. When I heard he'd abandoned you at the altar, I saw an opportunity. Maybe not the most romantic reasoning, but it's honest." "But my size," Ilara began. "Is irrelevant to me," Caleb interrupted firmly. "I need a partner who can work beside me, who can handle the challenges of frontier life, who won't crumble at the first hardship. Your body size tells me nothing about your ability to do those things. Your character and actions tell me everything. And from what I've observed, you're more than capable." Ilara felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time that day, they weren't tears of humiliation. "No one has ever talked to me like that before, like I'm a person worth knowing instead of just a body worth mocking." "Then you've been surrounded by fools," Caleb said. "But you're not anymore. You're on your way to your new home, to a new life, where you'll be valued for who you are, not judged for what you look like." The journey to Caleb's ranch took 4 hours, following a winding trail that climbed steadily into the mountains. As they traveled, Ilara began to relax slightly, the shock wearing off enough for her to start asking practical questions about her new life. "You said the work would be hard," she said. "What exactly will I be doing?" "Managing the household, keeping books for the ranch, helping coordinate with hired hands during busy seasons, preserving food for winter, tending the vegetable garden," Caleb listed. "I'm not expecting you to wrangle cattle or break horses. I have men for that. But I do need someone who can keep everything running smoothly, who can make decisions when I'm out on the range, who can be a true partner in running the operation." "I can do all of that," Ilara said, feeling a spark of excitement. "I've been doing similar work for my father's store for years, just without recognition or appreciation." "You'll get both from me," Caleb promised, "along with a fair share of the profits. This is a partnership, Ilara. What's mine is yours now." When they finally arrived at the ranch, Ilara gasped. It was beautiful and substantial, a large log house with a wide porch, a massive barn, several outbuildings, and fenced pastures stretching toward the mountains. Everything spoke of hard work, careful planning, and prosperity. "You built all this yourself?" she asked in wonder. "Over the past 8 years," Caleb confirmed. "Had help with some of the bigger projects, but most of it was my own labor. It's a good life, Ilara. Isolated, but good. The nearest neighbors are 10 miles away, and town is 4 hours on horseback. If you need more social interaction, we can make trips, but day to day, it's mostly just us and the hired hands." "Isolated sounds perfect right now," Ilara admitted. "I could use some distance from people who think they have the right to comment on my existence." Caleb helped her down from the wagon and showed her around the property, introducing her to the 3 ranch hands who helped run the Operation Miguel, a skilled horseman from Mexico, Tom, a former soldier who managed the cattle, and young Danny, who was learning the trade. All 3 men greeted Ilara with respectful courtesy, clearly taking their cue from Caleb's attitude. The house itself was surprisingly well appointed for a bachelor's dwelling. The main floor had a large kitchen, a dining area, and a comfortable sitting room with a fireplace and shelves of books. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms. "This one is yours," Caleb said, opening the door to a spacious room with a large bed, a wardrobe, and windows overlooking the mountains. "It has a lock on the inside, which you should use whenever you want privacy. I'll be in the room at the end of the hall. We're married legally, but I meant what I said about this being a partnership. I won't force myself on you or expect intimacy until and unless you're ready and willing." Ilara looked at him in wonder. "You're really giving me a choice about that too?" "Of course," Caleb said, looking genuinely confused that she would question it. "What kind of man forces his wife? That's not partnership, that's tyranny. When and if we come together as husband and wife in that way, it will be because we both want it, not because I demanded it as some kind of marital right." That night, after a simple dinner, during which Caleb asked Ilara about her interests and listened attentively to her answers, Ilara locked herself in her room and wept. But these were cleansing tears, releasing years of pain, humiliation, and worthlessness. This morning, she had been a joke, a figure of pity, a woman so undesirable that even a fortune hunter had refused her. Tonight, she was a rancher's wife, valued for her mind and character, given respect and choices and a future that was hers to shape. Over the following weeks, Ilara threw herself into her new role with an enthusiasm that surprised even Caleb. She reorganized the ranch's record-keeping system, implemented more efficient inventory management, negotiated better prices with suppliers, and even identified wasteful practices that were costing money. She learned to preserve meat, to bake bread in quantity, to manage a household on a scale she had never experienced. And she discovered she was good at it more than good. She was exceptional. Caleb, for his part, proved to be as good as his word. He treated Ilara with consistent respect, consulted her on ranch decisions, praised her contributions, and never once made her feel like her size was a problem or an embarrassment. He was patient with her learning curve, encouraging when she struggled, and genuinely pleased when she succeeded. Their relationship evolved gradually from respectful colleagues to genuine friends. They fell into a comfortable evening routine of reading together by the fire, discussing books and ideas and dreams. Caleb shared stories of his past, his years as a lawman cleaning up violent towns, the reasons he had left that life behind to ranch, his hopes for building something lasting. Ilara talked about her mother's death, her father's increasing coldness, her years of feeling invisible and worthless. "You're not invisible," Caleb said one evening after she had shared a particularly painful memory. "You're one of the most present people I've ever met. When you speak, people should listen. When you contribute, people should appreciate it. And anyone who couldn't see that was blind." 4 months into their marriage, their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of representatives from the Western Railroad Company. The railroad was expanding through the territory, and Caleb's ranch sat on land they wanted for their route. They offered to buy him out for a fraction of what the property was worth. "This is an insult," Caleb said, looking at the papers the smooth-talking railroad agent had presented. "My land is worth 10 times what you're offering." "Market value is what we say it is," the agent replied, with a cold smile. "And if you don't sell voluntarily, we can pursue other options. Eminent domain, for instance. Or we might discover that your land claim has irregularities that need to be investigated. Investigations can be expensive and time-consuming, Mr. Stone. It would be much simpler to just accept our generous offer and relocate." "Get off my property," Caleb said quietly, but with an edge that made the agent pale slightly. "And don't come back unless you're prepared to negotiate in good faith. I'm not selling, and I'm not being intimidated." Bored and for after the railroad men left, Caleb and Ilara discussed their options. "They won't give up," Ilara said, her mind already working through the implications. "Railroad companies have powerful connections. They can make life very difficult for people who stand in their way." "Then we'll stand together," Caleb said firmly, "and we'll make sure we're not standing alone. There are other ranchers and homesteaders in this territory who are facing the same pressure. If we organize, present a united front, we'll be harder to push around." Over the following weeks, they reached out to neighbors and formed an alliance of landowners determined to resist the railroad's predatory tactics. Ilara proved invaluable in this effort, using her organizational skills to coordinate meetings, document abuses, and build a coalition. She even reached out to the local Cheyenne band, whose hunting grounds were also threatened by the railroad's expansion. The Cheyenne were initially suspicious, but when Chief Redfeather and his niece Willow came to meet with Caleb and Alara, they were impressed by the couple's genuine respect and willingness to work together. "The railroad destroys everything it touches," Redfeather said gravely. "Your enemy is our enemy. We will stand with you." But the railroad wasn't deterred by organized resistance. If anything, it made them more aggressive. They sent hired thugs to intimidate isolated homesteaders. They bribed local officials to create legal obstacles. And one night, they escalated to violence. Ilara woke to the smell of smoke and Caleb's urgent voice. "Fire! The barn's on fire!" They rushed outside to see flames consuming the newly built barn, the horses screaming in terror inside. Caleb and his ranch hands managed to free the animals, but in the chaos, a burning beam fell, striking Caleb and pinning him to the ground. It took all 3 ranch hands and Alara working together to free him, and by the time they did, Caleb had a badly broken leg and severe burns on his arm. The doctor from town confirmed what Alara already knew: Caleb would recover, but it would take weeks, possibly months. He was bedridden, dependent on others, and in considerable pain. The railroad had struck at exactly the right moment, weakening their strongest defender. But they had underestimated Alara. The morning after the fire, while Caleb lay fevered and injured in his bed, Ilara called a meeting of all the landowners, the ranch hands, and the Cheyenne allies. Standing before them, this woman who had been mocked and dismissed all her life, she spoke with a clarity and force that commanded attention. "The railroad thinks they've won," she said. "They think that by injuring my husband and destroying our barn, they've broken our resistance. They're wrong. Caleb Stone is the strongest man I know, and he'll recover. But more than that, this fight was never about just one man or one ranch. It's about all of us, about our right to keep what we've built, about standing against bullies who think money and violence trump justice." She looked around at the assembled faces. "I know I'm not who you expected to be leading this fight. I'm not a man. I'm not a warrior. I'm not even from around here originally. I'm just a woman who was given a chance by someone who saw past surface judgments to recognize value. And I'm asking you to do the same, to look past your doubts about whether a woman can lead and see what I can actually do." Chief Redfeather stood up. "You have proven yourself, Mrs. Stone. You have honored agreements, spoken truthfully, and shown courage. We will follow you." One by one, the other landowners and ranch hands voiced their agreement. Ilara, the fat virgin bride, who had been laughed at just months ago, had become the leader of a resistance movement. Over the following weeks, Ilara orchestrated a campaign that combined legal action, community solidarity, and strategic pressure. She documented every instance of railroad intimidation and sent detailed reports to territorial authorities. She organized rotating guard shifts to protect vulnerable properties. She negotiated with merchants in town to boycott railroad business. And she worked with Willow, Chief Redfeather's niece, to ensure that the Cheyenne's legal claim to hunting rights was properly documented and filed. The railroad escalated again, sending a large group of hired guns to Caleb's ranch with orders to forcibly remove the stones and burn the rest of the property. But Ilara had anticipated this. When the hired guns arrived, they found not a vulnerable woman and an injured man, but dozens of armed settlers and Cheyenne warriors positioned around the ranch. Ilara stood on the porch, Caleb's rifle in her hands she had learned to shoot over the past months, with Willow on one side and Miguel on the other. Behind them, Caleb sat in a chair, his broken leg splinted but his own rifle across his lap, making it clear that injury hadn't made him helpless. "This is private property," Ilara called out to the hired guns. "And we have legal right to defend it. You're trespassing. Turn around and leave, or face the consequences." The leader of the hired guns, a scarred man named Dutch, laughed. "You think a fat woman and a cripple can stop us? We've got 20 guns, and you've got what? A few sodbusters and some savages? We've got right on our side, Ilara said firmly. And the law. The territorial marshal has been notified of the railroad's illegal tactics. He's on his way here with deputies. If you start shooting, you won't be fighting innocent landowners, you'll be fighting the law. How much is the railroad paying you? Enough to hang for murder? Dutch hesitated, clearly not expecting legal complications. Behind him, some of his men were already looking nervous, realizing that this wasn't the easy intimidation job they'd been promised. "Stand down," came a new voice. Everyone turned to see a man wearing a marshal's star, riding up with a dozen armed deputies. "I'm Marshal Thomas Weaver, and I have warrants for the arrest of several railroad agents on charges of arson, assault, and attempted fraud. Any of you boys working for the railroad want to add resisting arrest to that list?" The hired guns looked at each other, then at Dutch, who was clearly calculating his options. Finally, he lowered his gun. "We were just hired for a job," he said sullenly. "Didn't know it was illegal." "Ignorance isn't an excuse," the marshal said. "But if you boys ride out now and don't come back, I'll assume you were just following bad orders. The real criminals are the ones giving those orders." As the hired guns dispersed, the marshal dismounted and approached the porch. "Mrs. Stone, your letters were very detailed and very damning. We've been investigating the railroad's practices for months, but we needed witnesses willing to testify and evidence that would hold up in court. You provided both. The railroad agents responsible for the arson and intimidation are under arrest. The company's attempt to claim your land has been invalidated. You won." Ilara felt her knees go weak with relief. Caleb reached up from his chair and took her hand, squeezing it firmly. "We won," he corrected the marshal. "My wife won this. I was laid up injured, while she organized the defense, built the coalition, and documented everything. This victory is hers." The marshal smiled. "Then congratulations, Mrs. Stone. You've done what many men couldn't, stood up to the railroad and won. Your testimony will be crucial in the upcoming trials. The territorial governor himself is interested in making an example of companies that try to bully honest settlers." That night, after the settlers and Cheyenne allies had celebrated and departed, after the ranch hands had settled in for well-deserved rest, Ilara and Caleb sat together on their porch, watching the stars emerge over the mountains. "I was terrified," Ilara admitted. "The whole time, I was absolutely terrified that I'd fail, that I'd get people hurt, that I wasn't strong enough or smart enough to lead." "But you did it anyway," Caleb said. "That's what courage is, being terrified and acting anyway. You saved this ranch, Ilara. You saved our home, and probably a dozen other families' homes too. You're a hero." "I'm not a hero," Ilara protested. "I'm just someone who finally had something worth fighting for. You gave me that, Caleb. You gave me a home, a purpose, respect, and the chance to be more than what everyone told me I was. This is your victory as much as mine." "Ours," Caleb corrected gently. He shifted in his chair, grimacing slightly as his healing leg protested. "Ilara, I need to tell you something. When I married you, I told you it was because I needed a capable partner. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." Ilara looked at him questioningly. "The whole truth is that I'd been half in love with you for months before that wedding day," Caleb continued. "Watching you in town, seeing your kindness and competence, I found myself making excuses to visit the general store just to see you. When I heard you were marrying Barnaby, I was furious at him for being unworthy, at your father for arranging it, at myself for not acting sooner. When I heard he'd abandoned you, I saw a chance, and I took it, not just for a capable partner, but because I wanted you." Ilara felt tears streaming down her face. "You wanted me? Even before?" "I wanted you," Caleb confirmed. "I've wanted you all along, and these past months, watching you bloom and grow into your power, seeing you lead with such courage and wisdom, I've fallen completely, irrevocably in love with you. I know I said I wouldn't pressure you about intimacy, and I meant it. I'll wait as long as you need, but I wanted you to know how I feel." Ilara reached out and took Caleb's hand in both of hers. "I thought I married you out of desperation," she said softly, "to escape humiliation and get away from my father. But somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you too, with your strength and your kindness, and the way you see me as valuable instead of burdensome. I'm ready, Caleb. Ready to be your wife in every way if you still want me." "I've always wanted you," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "But my leg will heal," Ilara said with a gentle smile. "And until it does, we'll figure things out together. We've faced railroad agents and hired guns together. I think we can navigate this too." That night, they became husband and wife in truth as well as law, their lovemaking tender and awkward and beautiful two people who had been told all their lives that they didn't fit, finding that they fit together perfectly. In the months and years that followed, Ilara and Caleb's ranch became a symbol of successful resistance against corporate overreach. Other communities facing railroad pressure came to learn from their example. Ilara's testimony in the trials of the corrupt railroad agents helped secure convictions and reform policies. And the alliance between the settlers and the Cheyenne, forged in crisis, became a model for peaceful coexistence that benefited both communities. Ilara never forgot the humiliation of that wedding day, the laughter of the crowd, the moment when she thought her life was ending. But she also never forgot the moment Caleb had strode down that aisle and given her a choice. The moment he had shouted, "She's mine now, back off," and transformed her from an object of mockery into someone worthy of fierce protection. Years later, when travelers passed through and asked about the successful ranch run by the strong-willed woman and her powerful husband, the locals would tell the story not of a fat virgin bride who was laughed at, but of a woman who rose from public humiliation to become a leader, a hero, and a symbol of courage. And if someone occasionally tried to mock Ilara's size, they would quickly find themselves facing not just Caleb's protective fury, but the entire community's defense. Because Ilara Stone had earned her place not through appearance, but through action, and anyone who couldn't see that was welcome to test how seriously the territory took threats against one of its most respected citizens. In the quiet moments, sitting on her porch, watching the sunset over the mountains, Ilara would sometimes think about the girl who had stood at that altar in wilted wedding flowers, certain that being jilted was the worst thing that could happen to her. That girl could never have imagined this a thriving ranch, a devoted husband, a community that valued her leadership, and most precious of all, the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly enough, exactly as she was. The laughter that day had been cruel, meant to break her. Instead, it had been the catalyst for a transformation that proved that worth was never about appearance, never about other people's judgments, but always about courage, character, and the willingness to fight for what mattered. And in fighting for her home and her future, Ilara had finally, completely found herself.